Hi, welcome back to Into Deep, a podcast with me, Alyssa. In this podcast, we go a little too deep into everything feminism, from social media to science to pop culture to everything in between. Oh my god, I can't believe I get to say welcome back. That's so exciting. I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who listened to the first episode, and especially thank you to everyone who messaged me about it and said that they enjoyed it. I was really grateful to have such a nice response to the first episode, and it just made me want to put even more effort into researching and coming up with new ideas for this episode as well. Let me just say as well that it's literally 40 degrees right now, and I'm recording in a room with no aircon or fan because I want the audio quality to be good. So please recognize the sacrifice that I'm making for you, and please acknowledge that I will be drenched in sweat for this entire podcast. Thank you. So we're going to jump right into it. In this episode, we are talking about liberal feminism, and we're also going to touch on the idea of ethical porn by going into a very topical talking point, which is OnlyFans. This can be a pretty sensitive topic as well, so there might be times where I don't express myself exactly how I want to, and I don't want it to be kind of like offensive or anything. Just keep in mind that I am always blaming the industry and the system for the way that things are. It's never to put the blame on a woman or the women who are taken advantage of in this system. Yeah, I just wanted to make that quick announcement because it is a topic that can be very debatable, and people tend to have very differing opinions on it. Yeah, as well. And also let me know if there's anything that you feel like I didn't express very well, because I would be happy to talk about that in a better way if I can. So to start off with, I want to get into some theory. There are a lot of, I guess, different branches to feminism. For me, at least, I tend to lean quite radically. So I wanted to talk about the main branches of feminism that I think are popular these days. We're only going to go into 3 of them, but there are a lot of other, I guess, like strands of feminism as well that have different ideologies. A lot of my information was taken from a Dictionary of Gender Studies by Gabrielle Griffin. This was published in 2017. It actually seemed really up to date with a lot of online terms as well. So it seemed pretty interesting if anyone wants to have a look into that. Do you know what's actually really sad? I couldn't access all of it because I'm not a student anymore, and they've literally taken away my rights to access to research. Like, I used to be able to sign into like any institution and I would just have access to everything, which was kind of crazy, but now I'm kind of like, I'm limited to what I can find that's not behind a paywall. But a lot of the information from that dictionary was still available online. So the first branch of feminism I want to talk about is Marxist feminism. So this is a strand of feminist theory that grounds itself in Karl Marx's work on capitalism. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of him. I don't want to talk about Karl Marx too much, but he was the creator of the Communist Manifesto, and he kind of just argues against capitalism as a system. We're not really going to go too much into that in this episode, though I definitely want to talk about that in the future as well. So this branch of feminism argues that women's oppression is linked to the gendered structures of capitalism and the system of private property. So Marx divided labor into remunerated labor, which is labor mainly done by men. I mean, I guess now women are very active in the workforce as well, but this is mainly paid labor. The other form of labor would be reproductive labor, which is unpaid and carried out by women. The idea of having a separation between labor, which is paid and unpaid, and taking and acknowledging the fact that reproductive labor, which is carried out by women, is unpaid, kind of constitutes the basis of women's inequality under the patriarchy for a Marxist feminist. It also takes into account the fact that, or I guess what I would like to take into account when we're talking about reproductive labor, is that under capitalism, a woman birthing a child is kind of just creating new workers to work under the capitalistic system, and they are not being paid for that. So that's an important thing to note as well. This form of feminism kind of fell out of favor in the late 1900s after, I guess, the supposedly communist regimes fell. Under these nations, which were, again, supposedly under communist rule, the patriarchy and women's subjugation still existed. And so that's kind of the reason that it fell out of popularity, because we were seeing societies which were, marketing themselves as communist. I don't know how true they were to textbook communism, but regardless, because of the way the patriarchy and women's subjugation still existed in these societies, that is kind of the reason that it fell out of favor. Personally, I believe that Marxist and radical feminists have the same goal. Whether you believe capitalism or the patriarchy came first, it doesn't bother me if we're still calling for a restructuring of generally the same systems, because I think Marxist feminism kind of calls for a breakdown of capitalism, and a lot of the structures which keep women lower than men in society are based in capitalism. But I am going to get onto radical feminism as well, which is kind of the feminism which I think I believe in the most. I have a good quote from an article by Fahs titled "The Urgent Need for Radical Feminism Today." So she says, "Radical feminism remains one of the most fraught, maligned, and misunderstood segments of the feminist movement. This is in part a consequence of the incessant distortions applied to the word radical, both in the mainstream news media and in colloquial conversation. Radical does not mean extreme or outrageous, but rather a process of going to the roots of something, of digging deeper and deeper in order to understand a system, structure, or phenomenon." I think that's also a really good definition of radical feminism as well, because radical feminism kind of aims to remove the structures or restructure the systems which allow the patriarchy to exist and to thrive. And that's why I think that Marxist and radical feminists have the same goal, because it really is about restructuring the systems that we live under. One of the biggest issues for radical feminism, and I think the reason why it has kind of a poor view in popular society, is that it often gets conflated with TERFism. And if you don't know what that is trans-exclusionary radical feminism. This honestly makes me so angry, because a lot of I would say all of the radical feminist writing I have read has been extremely pro-trans people. TERFs tend to be TERFs have to be bio-essentialists and believe women should act as women just as men should act as men. And so I think it's a lie to be naming people who are against trans people as radical feminists, because in order to be against trans people, you still have to believe that gender exists and gender is something that we need. Gender is something that benefits women, when in reality, and as I talked about in my last episode, I believe the only way that there would be equality between men and women is if gender itself did not exist. So in reality, radical feminists would call for an end to gender separation entirely, and therefore I don't think would ever go against identifying as a different gender than they were assigned to at birth, as we already believe that gender has no biological basis. So I feel like I had to get that out of the way, because radical feminists do tend to get conflated with TERFs when I feel like there actually is no relation between them at all. But anyway, getting on to, I guess, the main strand of feminism which we'll be discussing today, that is liberal feminism. Liberal feminism kind of aims to achieve equality for women through legal means and social reform within current social systems that already exist, rather than kind of have an overhaul of those systems altogether. To me, it seems like liberal feminists are okay with existing under these systems, and they would kind of prefer to instead have law change and policies in place to push for equality for women. But, I think under these systems that equality is not really possible. It focuses on an individual's right to legal equality and ending, sex-based discrimination. So liberal feminists tend to believe that equality should be brought about through education and, as I said, policy changes. They try to change the system from within. Liberal feminism emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries in Western countries. So I guess it would be like one of the first forms of feminism that kind of activists use as a baseline to try and achieve equality for women. However, I think in like this day and age, it isn't really applicable to anything. Liberal feminism has a lot of criticisms. It has been criticized for being too heteronormative and also of dealing with the effects of the patriarchy and not the causes. The causes being the systems which allow for patriarchies to still exist. It's kind of like still living under patriarchy, but just like making it a little bit less bad, which I don't really think fixes anything. I would also say that it can definitely be critiqued for not being intersectional. It never takes into account women of color or women who are not straight or disabled women and the difficulties they face as a result of the intersex between feminism and racism or homophobia or ableism. I guess it also is often called like white feminism because it really only helps white women. The criticism for it being too heteronormative and kind of still having a basis in heterosexual relationships, just trying to achieve equality in marriage instead of overhauling marriage altogether, is like a very valid complaint as well. When we look at, radical feminism, a way that they want to deal with things is often through like separatism. So women working together, I guess, to form communities and be able to live separate from men, whereas liberal feminism aims to allow women to still have the same relationships with men, but just change laws and further educate people to somehow achieve equality that way, which I feel like is not really enough of a radical approach because, Marxists and radical feminists argue that liberal feminists fail to challenge the underlying causes of women's oppression. And changing laws and bringing about change politically is not really enough to bring about equality. There needs to be a fundamental change in social structures for any of that to come to fruition, I guess. One of the common kind of like, this is not the right word, but like subgenres of liberal feminism is choice feminism. Choice feminism is actually a critical term. It was coined by Linda Hirschman, and it argues against people who believe that feminism is about choice. It's kind of like people who say that if a woman chooses to do something, then it's automatically a feminist choice. It doesn't take into account that there's other pressures outside of that woman that would cause her to make that choice. Liberal feminists tend to believe that the women's movement has liberated them enough to make any choice they want. A good quote that I found that kind of like explains why choice feminism doesn't work, at least yet, is a quote by Ferguson from an article titled "Choice Feminism and the Fear of Politics." So she said, "Choice feminism is motivated by a fear of politics. It arises in response to three common criticisms of feminism: that it is too radical, too exclusionary, and too judgmental." She also continued on to say that it enables feminists to sidestep the difficulties of making the personal political, making judgments and demanding change of friends, family, and lovers. A good example of like choice feminism is women arguing that, they wear makeup for themselves, or, any other things that are very clearly motivated by living under a patriarchy, women tend to argue that it's actually an action that they're doing for themselves, without taking into account that there are obviously pressures outside of yourself in society which are acting on you and which can change the way you make choices, namely the patriarchy, which influences all of us. Moving on to the main topic of this podcast, we're talking about sex work today. One of the other, I think, problematic takes of choice feminism is that they're very pro-sex work, and they think it's an okay thing because they believe that the woman is always choosing to do it. And just to clarify, when I talk about sex work, I'm referring to anything from prostitution to porn to OnlyFans. I find that many women who are either younger or are only just getting into feminism tend to be quite pro-sex work. In an article I found by Rachel Mascolo titled "A Feminist Perspective on Sex Work," published last year in a journal by students at NYU, she talks about being a teenager and being extremely pro-sex work. She says, "Every part of me thought that female prostitution should be not only legal, but celebrated as a reclamation after so many years of violent sexual objectification and patriarchal oppression of the female body." This is something I can relate to because when I was on social media when I was a teenager, I was always pro women kind of reclaiming their sexuality, and women who, I guess it was Tumblr back then, that was OnlyFans core. I guess women who created pornography but did it as their own choice and did it on their own accord. That was something that I think was really celebrated, especially in the mid 2010s, and it was really popular and feminist to be pro sex work. Choice feminists online tend to make sex work out to be empowering because it is a choice made by women. As I said, choice feminism makes any choice made by a woman automatically feminist, even though obviously that isn't always the case. These days, the poster girls for this are kind of white women who are in really, I guess, advantaged situations, who have made heaps of money from OnlyFans with supposedly no negative impacts on their lives. It's often not people online who have actually had experience in the sex work industry who frame sex work to be a choice. And it's also very often men who argue that way as well. They argue that, it takes away a woman's autonomy to say that sex work is inherently bad because she's choosing to do it. If it's her choice, then it's her autonomous choice and her right to be able to choose to do that. Growing up, for me, and having access to actual feminist theory, I realized that there is no possible way that sex work is a feminist choice in any scenario. A creator on TikTok put this so perfectly. His name is Maven, if you want to look him up. He said, "Prostitution is a qualitatively different form of exploitation because it transforms the woman from a human into a workplace and into a product to be sold, bought, and traded. Sex work is not just a job, as the woman is both the worker and the product. She is transformed into an object to be used, non-consensually, may I add, because what we're going to get into is that prostitution is not consented to. Under capitalism, people are forced to sell their labor. Oppressed women who are unable to sell labor are instead forced to sell their body and its parts for use. Even using the term sex work instead of sexual exploitation sanitizes the concept and makes it out to be just a job. People have that capitalism argument where they're everyone is selling their body under patriarchy. I have no idea how people argue that working at Macca's is the same amount of degrading and demeaning as being a prostitute, but I don't know, each to their own, I guess. In reality, and I'm sure this doesn't come as a surprise to anyone, the majority of sex workers are women who are from poor socioeconomic backgrounds with little to no opportunity, and therefore have no choice but to do sex work in order to survive. In this case, one, it's not a choice, because if she didn't make that choice, she would not be able to survive. And two, particularly when money is involved, consent is automatically absent. Consent can't be purchased. If someone is only having sex with you because they're getting money for it, where is the consent involved in that? And from a Marxist feminist perspective, men who consume porn or pay for prostitutes require poor women to exist so that they can use them. They require women who are unable to sell their labor, but instead have to sell themselves, to exist in order to use them through pornography or as prostitutes. In a normal job, wage labor is exploitative because of the low wage to high value extracted from a worker's labor. Normal jobs don't run the risk of rape, violence, and coercive sex through money and power. I mean, I know the argument that all jobs have risks associated with them, especially when we're talking about physical laborers. Typically, and especially in, countries which are quite well off, there is some kind of law or there are some kind of policies in place that attempt to reduce these risks. The sex work industry contradicts with laws in general, and we're going to get into that later as well. A common argument that I see is that some women who take part in sex work claim to enjoy it. And I mean, this is often coming from women who are on OnlyFans and who have made a lot of money using it, and who have made a lot of money by choosing that career path. People claim this without mentioning that still the majority of women are coerced into this job. It's summarized well in a Medium essay by Esperanza Fonseca. She states that just because something exists as work and because some of those workers claim to enjoy it, that doesn't mean we should defend the industry. And when we are deciding whether to endorse a violent industry, which by and large is constituted by women who are coerced into it, the choice is clear: fight the industry, support the worker. And in this podcast, I never want to come across like I'm blaming women for the scenarios that they end up in. We're going to get into that as well when we talk about OnlyFans. But she also used the example in that essay of, and we've seen this recently as well in California, the incarcerated firefighters who are working for very low wages and who are kind of doing slave labor because they are imprisoned. Some of those people do say that it is a fulfilling job and they enjoy doing it, and it gives them something fulfilling to do while they are incarcerated. That doesn't necessarily mean that it should be allowed to happen just because some people enjoy it. As a whole, the system itself isn't good, especially when they're not being paid living wages and they're essentially forced into it. And that as well can be applied to sex work in the same way. One of the main, solutions people present for the exploitative nature of sex work is decriminalization. I would say decriminalization is also not an answer. It's a very liberal feminist point to argue that having laws can fix things. Liberal feminists focus on policy changes and laws and the rights of people, but having laws would never fix the high risk of rape and violence as a sex worker. This risk will always be present in an industry that survives on being anonymous, underground, and lawless. If it's already illegal somewhere and then is made decriminalized, there's literally no reason for pimps to now abide by the laws because they were already breaking them. Why would they not just keep breaking them? Especially when many sex workers do not have workers' rights to begin with. They're often immigrants who aren't citizens and therefore would not have the right to work in whichever country anyway. But it's very optimistic to think that decriminalization would automatically make sex workers have the same rights that women in other industries have. I just wanted to do a quick discussion of the data that's available based on Australian sex workers. So most of this information is taken from
an AIC report on migrant sex workers in Australia. It states that reports based on immigration data suggest that many migrant sex workers initially entered Australia on tourist, like either working holiday or student visas as well. But one of the problems that was recognised is that several factors, including language barriers and isolation, gender and race discrimination, stigma attached to sex work, and criminalisation of sex work, intersect for migrant sex workers to increase their vulnerability to experiencing and barriers to reporting incidents of violence and exploitation. In the survey that they conducted, overall 70% of respondents were classified as migrants, and 1/4 of respondents were classified as non-migrants, or people who were born in Australia. I guess one of the main issues that was recognised in this survey, the majority of responders were satisfied with their work conditions in Australia. However, a few of them did express discontent with the current experiences or past experiences that they'd had. One of the main problems, though, was that most migrant sex workers either experience difficulties accessing services like support services, likely because of their low self-rated English proficiency, and there were also other barriers such as like lack of knowledge about available services as well. And I guess that's one of the issues as well when sex work isn't regulated. I guess it makes it a lot more difficult for people who are migrants and don't have workers' rights in Australia to access services, I guess, which would give them better rights as an employee. And I think the results of that survey as well is good to acknowledge, because it does show that, you know, not every sex worker is dissatisfied with their conditions, and a lot of them are actually content with the position that they're in. However, it's more so about the existence of the industry, and a sex work industry exists, and when pornography exists, it's like in a world where those things exist, it's not possible for women to ever be equal. And I guess that is really the main problem. It's never the workers who partake in sex work that are the issue at all. It's always just the existence of the industry, which harms all women. And of course, there are like many cases of women who have experienced violence in this industry, and also it just always carries a high risk of that as well. But I think the results of this survey were interesting to look at, and it also shows the high percentage of sex workers being migrants who wouldn't really have a choice of working in a normal work environment because of their lack of rights in Australia, because of their immigration status, I guess.
Another important topic and liberal feminist talking point is the concept of ethical porn, which ties in closely with the emergence of OnlyFans. The problem with porn is that its origins and its effects can never be made into anything positive. It can never even be made into anything neutral. The origin of the word pornography comes from prostitution. It comes from the rape of women, and it has an insane amount of negative effects in society. Every rapist, sexual assaulter, child abuser is someone who consumes porn. And I'm not saying that everyone who consumes porn would become someone who commits violence in real life against women. But the fact is that consuming porn changes the way that men see women. And it also can change the way that women see themselves as well, 100%. Men who are like addicted to something that displays the degradation of women on film, are not going to be seeing women as people in real life. That's the fact of the matter, really. And the addictive nature of porn as well is one of the main issues. It keeps getting more extreme and degenerate as the further the addiction goes. When you look at like the most searched categories on porn websites, it's always things that are like verging on illegal, like teenagers or non-consensual or things like that. It's like A man who is aroused by a woman in pain or a woman who is being raped or having violence inflicted on her is a very dangerous man. And we'll get into that into another episode as well. But that's the reason why men who consume porn are always going to have some form of negative view of women and always going to think that women are below them. Because that is kind of what the industry is for. It's built on the degradation of women and the subordination of women and the usage of women for sexual pleasure, and it confirms the idea in men's brains that women exist only as sexual pleasure, only for sex and as sexual objects. So we're also going to get into something that is quite topical as well. We're going to be talking about OnlyFans girls. And you probably would have seen this in social media lately, particularly the two British content creators, Lily Phillips and Bonnie Blue. If you haven't heard about this, in October, Lily Phillips went viral for sleeping with 101 men in one day. Now, she is a self-proclaimed feminist, arguing that her work is indeed empowering as she is profiting off men's desire. There was, I guess, a documentary made by Josh Peters where he interviewed her directly after this event happened. After seeing some clips from that interview that she did, it's undeniable that she is a victim of a much larger system of sexual exploitation. Her career path, she claims that it is a choice, which gives her control and allows her to do something which she enjoys. But you can see in that video that the reality of sleeping with 100 men left her extremely emotional, like having a breakdown on camera. And also she stated that she dissociated for half of the process. Like, I think she said that she could only remember like 10 of the men that came in. Now, dissociation is something which is highly correlated with trauma as well. There seems to be two ways online which people were kind of responding to this entire event. Either, I guess, the classic slut shaming, which also was entwined with blaming her for being emotional, as she supposedly brought all that trauma on herself by choosing to do it. Again, choice feminism, we'll bring it up again and again. Or they claim that she is telling the truth and she does enjoy being a sex worker and thrives in this career path, saying that, she's lying about that would be taking away her autonomy. And so those were the two main takes that I saw online, as well as the take which I would present as well. It was put really well by Macieira-Fielding in an article about Lily Phillips. Autonomy is only meaningful if it's free from coercion, internal or external. An important thing to note as well is that Lily Phillips didn't even know how HIV was transferred. She thought it was a blood-only illness. And not all of the men who took part in this were even required to submit an STD test. Let me just also say that every man who took part in this should actually be put down. Genuinely, that is the most evil and disgusting thing to take part in, and the blame for things like this always fall onto the demand for it, and the reason why it exists is always the demand, obviously. The fact that STD tests weren't even required also brings up the problem of informed consent, and the fact that no one makes decisions, again, without external influences is really important to note. Is it possibly easier for her to pretend that, and I guess convince herself that it's a fantasy for her, rather than face the fact that this isn't something she enjoys and it is something that is traumatic? I think that it would be a really difficult task for her to change paths. Even if she does realize it's something that is traumatizing her actively and is a potential self-harm mechanism. Though she claims that she does it because she loves it, breaking down in tears after it's over kind of leads me to believe that perhaps it's more nuanced than that. She, just like all women, has been conditioned to view her self-worth as equal to her ability to please men. in that interview as well, she was making self-deprecating jokes about how she's only good for one thing. It's kind of easier for her to make jokes about the scenario than, I guess, acknowledge that it is something that's negative. And particularly when you're seeing a girl like become so emotional after a very obviously traumatic event, yet still tell herself that it's something that she enjoys and it's a fantasy for her just as much as it is for the men who took part in it. Like, you can't help but be extremely empathetic and see that she is a victim in this large system of sexual exploitation of women. That's also why choice feminism isn't possible, because under a patriarchal system, you can't make choices without influences from that said system. And I hate to bring up someone like Anna Paul as well, because a lot of the work she has done helping young girls with self-confidence is actually admirable. Especially on TikTok, the way that she talks about herself so positively is, I would say, has definitely had really good influences on the young girls who follow her and watch her. But being someone who's made so much money off OnlyFans, and even if she doesn't actively promote this lifestyle, it does still give young girls the idea that going into sex work is like free money. It's like doing a job that's easy and fun and getting all of this money and being able to go on holidays and everything. And it doesn't take into account that for most people who go into it, it is probably traumatic. And especially when you look at women who, you know, choose to take part in OnlyFans and then are actively saying that it's something that, you know, gives them power and allows them to make their own choices, it still does benefit the existence of the entire system. You know, it trickles down to the women who are being forced into prostitution. And again, I'm not saying that it's the women who take part in its fault, because I think in this system, any woman who is in sex work is to some degree a victim. But the real problem in all of these situations is the men who pay to have access to women's bodies, just to make that clear. Because without the demand for, even free access to women's bodies through porn, the system would not exist. It always comes back to the existence of the industry itself. When I was traveling, I was in Amsterdam, and I was in a hostel and I was talking to these two girls, and they were like suggesting visiting the red light district. And I was like, yeah, I don't think I'll come with you, because that would make me extremely sad. I don't know too much about the industry in Amsterdam, but I do know for a fact that a lot of the women there have been coerced into it. Even though it's decriminalized there, it's still likely that a lot of these women are not having the workers' rights that other workers in the country would have. And a lot of the women there are also, once again, immigrants who don't have access to, who don't have like workers' visas or citizenship, and therefore, you know, can't take part in normal labor, so are forced to do this type of labor, which is degrading and carries an extremely high risk. And so I was talking to this girl about that, and I was like, you know, I wouldn't feel comfortable going there because I'm really against the industry and I don't personally think it should be something that exists. And she replied and was like, it's always going to exist. The way I was like shocked. I was like, oh my God, are you joking? Like that, her saying that to me made me so sad, because I was like, there's even women who think that this industry is normal, or they think because it's been around for so long, it's, you know, something that is always going to be around. And as I mentioned in the last podcast as well, it's like, just because a system has existed for so long doesn't mean that it has to exist forever. And yeah, I was just so shocked by that comeback, especially from a woman. It like really made me quite sad. But we move on anyway. Particularly for OnlyFans creators and I guess showing sex work in a positive light. Either, I guess in Lily Phillips' case, it does seem like she's lying or trying to convince herself that it is something that she enjoys, because her insecurities are so deeply ingrained, and the fact that she believes, you know, that she's only good for this one thing is extremely sad. Or those who truly and luckily haven't experienced trauma as a sex worker, they tend to be used as examples for why the industry isn't all bad. But the existence of sex work and pornography itself harms all women. Men are more likely to be violent and rape and also not care about victims of violence and rape in a world where consumption of porn is normalized. When you talk to men and you can just tell, that they're not people who care about women being victims of sex crimes, it's likely because they're so addicted to porn that, they see things like that happening to women in porn, and in those videos, the women are enjoying it. Or even if they're not, it's something that they have taught themselves to be attracted to. And the porn industry targets young men as well, I think. Young women as well, I would say, into taking part in it. But it's so accessible and available for young people. When you're consuming content like that as a teenager, the brain damage that must cause is insane. When you're consuming content like that is degrading women from such a young age, unlearning that is has got to be an extremely difficult task. And especially when you see people online saying that they enjoy being in porn or they enjoy being an OnlyFans creator, it only strengthens that view that women enjoy being an object of desire. And, saying that they can't enjoy that is taking away their autonomy. And it's often used as an excuse as well by men who consume porn, and they're like, well, women can enjoy this, so me consuming it isn't something that is necessarily negative, when it's just factual that consuming content like that is going to always have a negative impact on the person who's consuming it, and particularly on women as well. And women in the worldwide system are negatively impacted by the existence of the sex work industry. In that same article that I was referencing, the author kind of mentions how anti-porn feminists, like Andrea Dworkin, who I was talking about in the last episode, and saying that men involved in Lily's challenge aren't neutral participants. They're active players in a system that depends on women's commodification. Any man who consumes porn, therefore, is someone who is actively upholding the patriarchy and upholding the exploitation of women sexually. I would argue as well that our current expectations of consent and our current definition of consent do not take into account that pressure is constantly put on women to be sexually attractive to men and sexually available for men as well, which means oftentimes our consent is influenced by this pressure. I'd also like to delve further into that at another point as well. But she also goes on to say that in a world where even human intimacy is commodified, none of us are safe from exploitation, which definitely echoes my sentiment that a choice to take part in or be pro-sex work does hurt all women. I guess that's true for any other choices you make as well. When you choose to purchase products or consume services that are knowingly exploiting people to a huge degree, like people who order things from Temu, your choice to do that is hurting people. Necessarily, it's hurting people. You can't consume things which are, I guess, necessitated by exploitation of people without yourself exploiting those people. Another important thing to recognize in terms of OnlyFans is the pressure to stand out. And this was also referenced in that article as well that I've been referencing. That pressure pushes creators to extremes. After Lily Phillips completed the sleeping with 100 men in a day challenge, girl, this sounds like a YouTube challenge, cinnamon challenge. Yeah, that's literally, even saying it's a challenge kind of makes it out to be something that that's fun or easy to do. And even the wording there is something that's damaging. After she completed that, her next aim was to sleep with 1,000 men in a day. But she was recently beat to that goal by Bonnie Blue. This kind of coincides with the addictive nature of porn. to become more and more dangerous, perverted, and extreme in order to fulfill the increasing addictions of men. And that addiction of men to porn just puts women in more dangerous scenarios where they're more likely to be abused or victims of violence in the sex work industry. And it's also damaging for men as well. Once they've reached a point where they can't be aroused unless violence is being inflicted on a woman, like, God, they literally need to be put in like a rehabilitation program, because men like that in society are evil, like they're dangerous. And these are the same type of men who rape women and abuse women or beat their wives. It's the same type of man who is addicted to porn or doesn't see women as equal. And it all connects together in that system, and it all exists as a system in order to uphold patriarchy. And when we ask whether, creators like Lily Phillips are really doing this for themselves and because it's something that they enjoy doing, or if they're going to more extreme means in order to stay relevant on an increasingly crowded platform, in order to keep making money, in order to become more popular and liked by people, particularly when it's women who very clearly have low self-esteem, that is a very dangerous thing to add into the mix. That's probably all of the time that I have to discuss today. Obviously, I didn't get too deep into a lot of the topics. If you're interested in hearing more about any of the things that I mentioned, please let me know. I guess some good takeaways from this is that your choices do harm other people. And also, I'm not absolving myself of blame here. Like, I wear makeup, I do things that are only required of women under a patriarchal society because it's easier for me to live my life that way. And my decisions to do those things do continue to uphold a patriarchal society. I think it's important to at least recognize that not all of our decisions are made from free will, and they are influenced by the structures which we are under. Another important thing that I guess I touched on is that porn can never be ethical, because by its definition, it's something that takes advantage of women. By its definition, it's something that has negative effects on women through changing like the literal brain chemistry of men to view women as objects and lower than them and available to be used by them. And another important thing that I talked about is that, at least for me, I do not see sex work as the same as normal work because of the risks involved with sex work and the lack of legalities and the lack of access to the same rights that other workers have. So I guess they're important takeaways which I wanted to talk about in this podcast. So again, thank you so much for listening. I hope that you learned something new, or I hope that I gave you some differing perspectives on sex work, or I opened up the way that you think a little bit in order to maybe be more critical of things that you see online. So I hope you enjoyed. Have an amazing week, and thank you so much for listening. Bye.